The rust was the first thing you saw. It crept over the bicycle's frame like a dry, reddish fungus, flaking away in the crisp autumn air. The chain, a greasy, sagging loop of metal, hung with the weariness of 1,000 hard-fought miles. One pedal was bent at a slight, awkward angle, and the handlebars were wrapped in frayed electrical tape that was peeling back to reveal pitted chrome. To the patrons of the Gilded Spoon, a cafe where a single cup of coffee cost more than an hour's minimum wage, the bike was not just an object. It was an accusation, an unsightly blight on their curated afternoon of quiet luxury. Its owner, a boy of about 17 named Leo, stood beside it, his own form as worn and out of place as his transportation. His jeans were faded to a pale, washed-out blue at the knees, and his thin jacket offered little defense against the wind that funneled down the polished avenue. He kept his gaze fixed on the cracked screen of an old smartphone, his thumb hovering, waiting for a message that refused to arrive. Every few seconds, his eyes would dart up, scanning the street, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He was waiting for a call about a second job, one that would let him work the morning shift before school, so he could be home in the afternoons for his mom. The silence from his phone was a heavy, suffocating blanket. A well-dressed couple exited the cafe, their laughter cutting through the air. The woman's eyes landed on the rusty bike, and her smile faltered into a delicate sneer. She leaned into her partner, whispering something that was lost to the wind but carried by her expression. Contempt, disgust. Leo felt their judgment like a physical blow, a cold slap against his cheek. He hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself smaller, to shrink into the background of brick and glass. He nudged the bike with his sneaker, attempting to tuck it more tightly against the lamppost, as if he could hide its poverty. His movement was a mistake. The kickstand, already fragile, gave a metallic groan and buckled. The bike crashed sideways onto the pavement with a clatter of loose parts that sounded like a dropped box of tools. The noise was loud, sharp, and vulgar in the quiet street. Heads turned. Faces in the cafe window peered out, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to open disdain. Leo's face burned with a hot, spreading shame. He scrambled to lift the bike, his fingers fumbling with the greasy chain that had slipped from its sprocket. He was no longer just a boy waiting. He was a spectacle, a clumsy, impoverished intrusion. The weight of their stares was immense, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He just wanted to disappear, to pedal away into obscurity, but his only means of escape lay broken and exposed on the pristine sidewalk. Just as Leo managed to prop the bike back against the lamppost, the glass door of the Gilded Spoon swung open again, revealing a man who seemed to be carved from wealth itself. His name was Arthur Sterling, and he moved with the unthinking arrogance of someone who had never been told no. His suit was a sharp, tailored gray, his shoes gleamed with a fresh polish, and a gold watch glinted on his wrist as he adjusted his tie. He was speaking loudly into his phone, his voice a commanding baritone that sliced through the afternoon quiet. "No, the deal is closed. Tell them my offer is final. They'll take it." He snapped his phone shut and looked around, an impatient frown creasing his brow as he waited for the valet to retrieve his car. His gaze swept past the storefronts, the other patrons, and then it landed on Leo and his dilapidated bicycle. Sterling's frown deepened into a look of profound irritation, as if he'd just spotted a cockroach on his dessert plate. He took a deliberate step closer, his friends emerging from the cafe to flank him. "Good Lord," Sterling boomed, his voice dripping with theatrical disgust. "Is that a bicycle or a tetanus trap?" His friends chuckled, a sycophantic chorus. Leo froze, his hands still dirty with grease from the chain. He said nothing, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He stared at a crack in the pavement, praying the man would just get in his car and leave. But Sterling was enjoying himself. He was performing for his audience. "Seriously, kid," he continued, gesturing grandly at the bike, "you should be paying the city to haul that junk away. It's a public health hazard. It's depressing just looking at it." Leo's silence only seemed to embolden him. He took another step forward, invading Leo's personal space. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Sterling's eyes roamed over Leo's worn clothes, the scuffed tips of his sneakers, the raw anxiety in his posture. "Let me guess. You're here to beg. Or maybe scope the place out. See what you can steal later." The accusation hung in the air, venomous and ugly. Leo finally looked up, his eyes meeting Sterling's for a brief, defiant second before dropping again. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. He wouldn't beg, and he wouldn't argue. He would just endure. Seeing he wasn't getting the rise he wanted, Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. With a flourish, he extracted a single crumpled dollar bill. He held it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "Here," he said, flicking his wrist. The dollar fluttered through the air and landed in a murky puddle near Leo's feet. "Go buy some grease for that thing. Or a sandwich. Whatever. Just get it out of my sight." The small crowd of onlookers watched, their silence a form of complicity. The dollar, soaked and pathetic, was the ultimate humiliation, a dismissal of his entire existence into the price of a cheap trinket. The wet dollar bill seemed to mock him from the puddle, its green ink bleeding into the gray water. For a moment, a hot, white rage surged through Leo. He wanted to scream, to throw the man's charity back in his face, to tell him what that rusty bicycle really meant. But the anger receded as quickly as it came, replaced by a familiar, hollow ache. This sting was nothing new. It was just another drop in an ocean of hardship he navigated every single day. His mind drifted away from the polished street and the sneering face of Arthur Sterling. He saw his mother, propped up on pillows in their small living room, the television murmuring softly in the background. He saw the faint, tired smile she would give him when he got home, a smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore. The medical bills were stacked on their small kitchen table, a tower of clinical white envelopes that represented a debt so vast it felt like a physical weight on his chest. His part-time job washing dishes at a diner barely covered their groceries, let alone the copays for her prescriptions. That bicycle, that tetanus trap, was his lifeline. It was the engine of their survival. It carried him across town before sunrise to the diner, its wobbly frame and slipping chain a familiar, rhythmic struggle. It carried him to the pharmacy, a small basket he'd rigged to the front handlebars often filled with his mother's medication. It carried him to and from school, where he fought to keep his grades up, clinging to the hope of a scholarship, a way out. The bike was more than just metal and rubber. It was his father's. His dad, Mike, had been a mechanic, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with grease, but whose heart was impossibly clean. He could listen to an engine and diagnose its ailments like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. He had passed away 3 years ago, a sudden heart attack that had ripped the world out from under them. Before he died, he had given the bike to Leo. "It's not much, kiddo," he'd said, clapping a hand on Leo's shoulder. "But it's got a good frame, solid bones. You take care of it and it'll take care of you. Things don't have to be new to be strong." Every time Leo tightened a loose bolt or patched the worn-out inner tube, he felt a connection to his father. He was keeping his father's philosophy alive. You don't throw things away just because they're old. You find their strength, you fix what's broken, and you make them last. The rust wasn't a sign of neglect. It was a testament to endurance. It was a map of every winter he'd ridden through, every rainstorm he'd been caught in. Sterling's crumpled dollar wasn't just an insult to him. It was an insult to his father's memory, to the dignity of hard work and resilience. Leo looked from the puddle back to the bike. He didn't see junk. He saw his father's hands. He saw his mother's medicine. He saw his only path forward. And he stood a little taller, the shame on his face hardening into quiet resolve. The purr of a finely tuned engine sliced through the tension. The valet, a young man with a nervous expression, had pulled Arthur Sterling's car to the curb. It was a machine of breathtaking beauty, a sleek, black convertible sports car that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its polished exterior reflected the disapproving faces of the onlookers like a dark mirror. Sterling gave a curt nod, tossing the valet the key fob witout making eye contact. He was eager to leave the unpleasantness behind, to retreat back into his world of comfort and power. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse. The brief, ugly drama concluded. They had seen a rich man belittle a poor boy, and now it was over. Life would go on. No one spoke up. No one met Leo's eyes. They were silent witnesses, their inaction a quiet endorsement of the status quo. In their world, men like Sterling won, and boys like Leo were meant to be invisible. Sterling, basking in the perceived victory, couldn't resist one last parting shot. He turned back to Leo, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Let this be a lesson to you, kid," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is what happens when you don't work hard. You end up with nothing, a leech on society." Remember that he opened the driver's side door, preparing to slide into the plush leather seat. At that exact moment, a flash of pink and a squeal of delight cut through the tense atmosphere. A little girl, no older than 5, had wriggled free from her mother's grasp. Chasing a fluttering pigeon, she toddled directly off the curb and into the street, her blonde pigtails bouncing. She tripped on an uneven patch of asphalt and fell, landing with a soft thud on the ground. She sat there for a stunned second, her blue eyes wide with surprise, directly in the path of Sterling's car. The mother screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror that shattered the afternoon. Lily! Sterling, distracted by his own monologue, had already put the car in gear. His foot was on the accelerator. The car lurched forward. Time seemed to slow down. The mother's hand was outstretched, frozen in a gesture of helpless horror. The valet's mouth was open, a silent scream. The faces in the crowd were masks of shock. The gleaming black hood of the car was a predator, closing in on its tiny, unsuspecting prey. Lily just sat there, looking at the approaching vehicle with a child's innocent confusion, a small scrape already welling with blood on her knee. The world held its breath. The distance was impossibly short. There was no time for anyone to do anything. The chrome grille was less than 5 feet from her small body. In the split second that everyone else was frozen in horror, Leo moved. There was no thought, no calculation of risk or cost. There was only instinct, a pure, unthinking impulse to protect. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't waste a precious moment trying to get the driver's attention. He acted. With a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed the handlebars of his rusty bicycle and shoved it forward with all his might. The bike, his father's bike, his lifeline, flew off the curb. It landed directly in the path of the oncoming car, a desperate, sacrificial shield. The sound that followed was sickening, a violent symphony of destruction. A high-pitched screech of rubber on asphalt as Sterling slammed on the brakes, followed by a horrific, grinding crunch as the car's heavy front bumper collided with the bicycle's thin frame. Metal twisted and tore. The front tire of the multi-thousand-dollar sports car met the jagged, bent pedal of the junk bike, and with a loud hiss, the tire exploded. The car, its momentum violently arrested, lurched to a dead stop. The front of the vehicle hovered mere inches from the little girl's head. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and the acrid scent of fear. But Leo was already past the wreckage. While the car was still shuddering to a halt, he had vaulted over the mangled remains of his bike and was kneeling by the little girl's side. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice astonishingly calm and gentle. He scooped her up in his arms, his movements sure and steady. He checked her over quickly, his eyes scanning for any injury beyond the scraped knee. Finding none, he held her close for a second, shielding her face from the chaos. He then turned and walked to her mother, who was now on her knees on the sidewalk, sobbing with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. He placed the child, who was just beginning to cry from the shock, into her mother's trembling arms. Only then did Leo allow himself to look back. His bicycle was destroyed. It was no longer a bike. It was a mangled knot of scrap metal, wedged grotesquely under the tire of the luxury car. The frame was bent into a horrifying U-shape. The wheels were buckled, the spokes shattered. It was completely, irrevocably gone. He looked at the wreckage, the physical embodiment of his father's legacy and his own daily struggle, now just trash on the asphalt. And on his face, there was not a flicker of regret. There was only the quiet, profound relief of a child saved. The silence that followed the crash was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. The hiss of the deflated tire was the only sound. The crowd, which had been a collection of passive individuals, was now a single, unified entity, bound by the shared witness of a selfless act. The mood on the street had undergone a seismic shift. The casual disdain for Leo had evaporated, replaced by a wave of stunned admiration and collective shame. "My God," a woman whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "Did you see that?" He didn't even hesitate. An older man next to her nodded, his eyes wide. "He saved her life. That car would have—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The unspoken horror hung in the air. People looked at Leo, then at the mangled bike, then back at Leo. They were seeing him for the first time, not as a piece of urban blight, but as a hero. The door of the sports car flew open. Arthur Sterling stumbled out, his face not filled with relief, but contorted with rage. His eyes were fixed on the damage to his precious vehicle. "You idiot!" he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Leo. "Look what you've done. That's a custom wheel. You've ruined my car. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you've got." But his voice, which had been so powerful and commanding moments before, now sounded shrill and pathetic. It lacked its earlier authority. Before Leo could even process the threat, the little girl's mother was on her feet. She stormed over to Sterling, her face streaked with tears but her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "Are you serious?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with emotion. "My daughter. He saved my daughter's life. And all you care about is your stupid car." She jabbed a finger toward Leo. "That boy is a hero. And you are a monster." The crowd, no longer silent, murmured in loud agreement. "She's right," someone shouted from the back. "The kid saved her." Faces that had been averted in complicity now turned on Sterling, their expressions hard with disgust. The valet, who had been frozen by the curb, finally moved. He pulled out his phone and quietly called the police, his duty as an employee. But then, with a second, more deliberate motion, he scrolled through his contacts and made another call. A very different kind of call. Sterling stood isolated, the target of the community's sudden, unified contempt. His wealth, which had been his shield and his weapon, was now useless against the moral clarity of the moment. He had been exposed, his character laid bare, and what was revealed was ugly and small. He looked from the angry mother to the condemning faces in the crowd, his blustering fury slowly crumbling into bewildered fear. A low rumble started in the distance, almost imperceptible at first, like the faint vibration of a far-off train. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears so much as a feeling that resonated deep in your chest cavity. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural thrum that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Heads turned from the drama on the sidewalk, scanning the length of the avenue. Down the street, a single piercing headlight cut through the afternoon haze. It was followed by another, then two more, then a dozen, then a blinding wave of them. They crested the small hill at the edge of the town center, a rolling tide of chrome and black leather. The Hells Angels had arrived. It wasn't just a handful of riders. It was a procession, an overwhelming force. They poured into the street, their engines dropping into a low, menacing idle that was more intimidating than a full-throated roar. One by one, they filled the block, parking their bikes in a staggered, disciplined formation that effectively sealed off the entire area. There must have been 150 of them. The street became a forest of polished steel, a fortress of rumbling engines. The onlookers, who had been so bold in confronting Sterling, now fell silent, shrinking back toward the storefronts. The sheer presence of the club was an absolute, non-negotiable display of power. They dismounted in near unison, the sound of their heavy boots hitting the pavement a series of quiet, authoritative thuds. They didn't shout. They didn't make threats. They simply were. A wall of patched leather vests, grim faces, and an unspoken promise of consequence. At their head was a man who moved with the quiet gravity of a leader. His beard was more salt than pepper, and his hair was pulled back in a tight braid. His eyes, set in a weathered face, seemed to miss nothing. On his vest, above the iconic Death's Head patch, was a simple rocker that read Preacher. He was the chapter president. Preacher's gaze swept over the scene. The luxury car with its flattened tire, the horrified face of Arthur Sterling, the grateful mother clutching her child, the mangled wreckage of the bicycle, and finally, the quiet, grease-stained boy standing beside it. He walked forward, his boots making no sound, moving with a predator's grace. He walked right past Sterling as if the man were nothing more than a piece of street furniture, not even gracing him with a glance. His focus was singular. He stopped directly in front of Leo, his shadow falling over the boy. The entire street held its breath, waiting to see what this terrifying, silent force would do next. Preacher stood before Leo, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the twisted metal that was once a bicycle, his eyes lingering on the wreckage for a long moment. The silence was absolute, broken only by the synchronized rhythmic grumble of 150 idling V-twin engines. Then, a man stepped out from the ranks of the bikers. He was older, with a paunch straining against his leather vest and deep lines etched around his eyes. He approached the wreckage and knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate. He gently touched a piece of the bent frame. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice rough, thick with an emotion that sounded like gravel and grief. "That was Mike's bike." He looked up, first at Preacher, then at Leo. "That's Mike's boy." A ripple of understanding went through the bikers closest to them. Names and memories were murmured through the ranks. The valet, the young man who had made the second phone call, stepped forward nervously. "That's my cousin Jimmy," he said, nodding toward the older biker. "I called him. I saw what happened, but the story was deeper than a single phone call." Jimmy, the older biker, stood up and faced his brothers. "Mike," he began, his voice gaining strength, "was Mike Callahan. He ran the old garage down on Mill Road for 20 years. He pointed a thick finger at Leo. "This is his son, Leo. Mike was a friend to the club. A real friend." The story began to unfold, pieced together by Jimmy and a few other veteran members. Mike Callahan had never been a member, never worn a patch. He was a civilian, a family man, but he was a man of profound honor. For 2 decades, he had been the club's unofficial mechanic. When a brother's bike broke down and money was tight, Mike would fix it, sometimes for a promise of payment later, often for nothing more than a handshake and a shared beer. "I remember," another biker chimed in, his voice low. "My first bike, the clutch went out on the highway. Had no cash, no way home. Mike came out with his truck, towed it to his shop, and had me back on the road by morning. Said I could pay him whenever." The testimonies continued, painting a portrait of a man who embodied the very principles the club held sacred: loyalty, integrity, and quiet generosity. "Mike would give you the shirt off his back," Jimmy said, his eyes now fixed on Leo. "He'd fix your ride, feed you, and never ask for a thing in return. He was one of us, in spirit." He then gestured to the mangled bicycle. "He gave that bike to the kid right before he passed. Told him to take care of it." The meaning of Leo's action suddenly crystallized for everyone present. He hadn't just sacrificed his transportation. He had sacrificed the last tangible piece of his honorable father, a legacy of resilience and care, to save a stranger's child from the carelessness of a man who valued none of those things. It was an act of profound, inherited honor. Preacher's gaze shifted from the wreckage to Leo's face, and for the first time, a flicker of something akin to respect softened his hard features. He absorbed the weight of the story, the lineage of honor that passed from father to son, culminating in this single, selfless act on a public street. He then turned slowly, and his eyes finally fell upon Arthur Sterling. The look was not one of rage, but of cold, clinical dismissal. It was the look a man gives an insect just before he crushes it. Sterling, who had been puffing his chest out moments before, seemed to shrink under that gaze, his expensive suit offering no protection. Preacher didn't waste a single word on him. Instead, he turned to his men, his voice calm but carrying over the rumble of the engines. "This man," he said, gesturing contemptuously towards Sterling, "owes the boy a new bike." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And he owes this club for the disrespect shown to the son of our friend at his unspoken command." Four of the largest bikers detached themselves from the group. They moved with an unnerving lack of haste, their presence alone a suffocating threat. They formed a loose circle around Sterling, not touching him, but creating an impassable cage of leather and muscle. One of them, a giant of a man with a shaved head, simply pointed down the street. "There's an ATM in the bank over there," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're going to make a withdrawal." Sterling, his face the color of ash, looked around for help that wasn't there. The police had arrived but were keeping their distance, wisely assessing the situation as something far beyond a simple traffic incident. Flanked by his silent, intimidating escorts, Sterling began the short, humiliating walk to the bank. While this was happening, another group of bikers moved toward the wreckage. With a reverence that was jarring to the onlookers, they began to carefully extricate the remains of Leo's bike from under the car. They handled the twisted, greasy metal not like junk, but like the bones of a fallen soldier. They worked together, their movements efficient and respectful, laying the pieces gently on a clean blanket someone had produced from a saddlebag. They were not clearing debris. They were recovering a relic. Preacher watched them for a moment, then turned back to Leo. The boy stood silently, overwhelmed, watching everything unfold as if in a dream. Preacher reached up and began to unbutton his own jacket. It wasn't his formal club vest, his cut, which was sacred. It was his personal riding jacket, a heavy, worn piece of black leather, softened by years on the road, smelling faintly of engine oil and open air. He slid it off his own shoulders and, in a gesture of profound significance, draped it over Leo's thin frame. The jacket was huge on him, swallowing his slender shoulders. "Your father was a good man," Preacher said, his voice low and for Leo's ears only. "You've honored him today." The weight of the leather was the weight of protection, of acceptance, of belonging. The procession to the bank was a slow, deliberate march of shame. Arthur Sterling, flanked by 4 silent giants, walked like a man on his way to the gallows. The bikers didn't threaten him. They didn't lay a hand on him. But their proximity was a constant, suffocating pressure. The community watched, their earlier anger at Sterling now replaced by a kind of grim satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, came in many forms, and today it wore leather and rode a Harley. At the ATM, Sterling fumbled with his card, his hands shaking so badly he had to try 3 times to insert it correctly. He withdrew the maximum daily limit, a thick stack of $20 bills. One of the bikers took the cash without a word, counted it, and then simply looked at Sterling. "Again," he grunted. "Different card." Sterling, pale and sweating, complied. He emptied one account after another until he had a substantial sum of cash, far more than any bicycle would ever cost. The money was brought back and handed directly to Preacher. He took the thick bundle of bills, glanced at it, and then looked at Leo. He peeled off a small portion of the stack, still a significant amount of money, and held it out to the boy. "This is for your mother," Preacher said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For her medicine, for groceries. You make sure she's comfortable." Leo hesitated, his ingrained pride making it difficult to accept. But he saw the look in Preacher's eyes, a look that said this was not charity, but a debt being settled. He took the money, his hand trembling slightly, and whispered, "Thank you." Preacher nodded, then handed the larger bundle of cash to another one of his men. "Henderson's bike shop, 2 towns over," he commanded. "Get the best they have, the absolute best, top of the line, and bring it here." The biker nodded once and swung a leg over his motorcycle. With a deafening roar that momentarily drowned out all other sound, He peeled away from the group and disappeared down the road. An hour passed. The bikers remained, a silent, unmoving vigil. They had become a part of the town's landscape, a temporary monument to loyalty. The police directed traffic around the block, explaining nothing. Then, a new sound. Not a motorcycle, but the hum of a delivery truck. It pulled up, and the biker who had left emerged, along with the owner of Henderson's bike shop himself. They unloaded a bicycle that was the polar opposite of Leo's old one. It was a marvel of modern engineering. A lightweight carbon fiber frame, hydraulic disc brakes, and a gear system as complex and precise as a Swiss watch. But as they brought it forward, another biker, a man known for his skill as a metalworker and artist, stepped up. In his gloved hand, he held a small, carefully cleaned piece of metal. The head badge from Leo's father's bike, the small, embossed insignia that Mike Callahan had always kept polished. He had painstakingly cut it from the mangled frame. Using a portable welding torch with surgical precision, he fused the small piece of history onto the new bike's frame, right below the handlebars, where Leo would see it every time he rode. It was a bridge between the past and the future, a piece of his father's soul, now and forever a part of his new journey. The new bicycle gleamed in the late afternoon sun, a symbol of rebirth. The small, welded head badge from the old frame caught the light, a single point of history on a canvas of the future. The transformation was complete. Preacher looked at Leo, then at the assembled crowd, and finally at his men. He gave a short, sharp nod. The time for lessons and retribution was over. The time for honor had come. Without a word, the bikers began to move. They swung their legs over their machines, the leather of their pants creaking, the metal of their boots scraping softly on the pavement. With practiced efficiency, they started their engines, the individual roars merging into one single, thunderous wave of sound. But they didn't ride away. Instead, they arranged themselves, their movements fluid and coordinated. They formed two parallel lines down the center of the street, creating a wide, open corridor. It was a gauntlet of chrome and steel, an honor guard of outlaws. Preacher walked over to Leo, who stood mesmerized, the heavy leather jacket still draped over his shoulders. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm and paternal. "Go on, son," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the roar of the engines. "It's your road." Leo looked at Preacher, his eyes filled with a gratitude too deep for words. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He swung his leg over the new bike, his hands finding the handlebars. His fingers brushed against the old, familiar emblem of his father's bike, and a wave of strength flowed through him. He pushed off, the bike moving forward with an effortless glide he had never experienced before. He rode slowly down the corridor of motorcycles. As he passed, the bikers revved their engines, the sound rising in a deafening, celebratory salute. It was not a sound of anger or intimidation. It was a roar of respect, a declaration that echoed off the brick buildings and shook the glass in the windows of the Gilded Spoon. It was the sound of a brotherhood acknowledging one of their own. The townspeople, who had witnessed every moment of the day's drama, watched in awed silence. They saw the boy who they had dismissed and judged just hours before, now being honored by the most feared and respected men in the state. They were witnessing the birth of a local legend. Leo reached the end of the corridor and didn't look back. He straightened his shoulders, his posture no longer slumped with anxiety but upright with a newfound, hard-earned dignity. He pedaled away, the setting sun at his back, the roar of 150 motorcycles his parting anthem. The bikers held their formation until he was out of sight. Then, as one, they turned and rolled out of town, their thunder fading back into a distant rumble, leaving behind an empty street, a shamed man, and a community forever changed by the quiet courage of one boy and the unwavering loyalty of a brotherhood. The air was still, but the respect lingered, thick and indelible.